So thanks for having me. What I wanted to talk about tonight is a country that doesn't get nearly as much kind of exposure as it should, and one that has so many nuanced differences to the rest of the continent, and lots of things that I think the rest of us can learn from. So this is just I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but this is just a brief overview of Ethiopia itself, and one particular community-based conservation initiative that has been successful for hundreds of years. So the question I wanted to start with, and just for you guys to turn over in your heads over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, what actually drives conservation? And I don't mean, in terms of, legislation or whatever, but what actually leads to a society or a community deciding to set aside natural resources and foregoing, at least for a temporary period, the use of those resources, and also tolerating the potential adverse costs that result from conserving those resources. And then allied to that, I'm sure for the most part, we all come from one particular perspective. And the other thing I'd like to ask you to do is to just consider as we go through tonight, what is that perspective? What's your own personal perspective, and what drives your own personal understanding of why we set land or ecosystems aside for conservation? If you look at the national parks movement, Achrab has got a totally different reason for its proclamation as a national park to Kruger or Khalkhadi and so on. And there's a whole plethora of things to consider. So briefly, 35 minutes hopefully tonight, we'll see. And I'll give you a short 25 million year geological and climate history of Ethiopia, what endemism patterns resulted for birds and mammals from that, how human distribution adapted to that, what kind of agricultural practices followed, what that means for human population density, land ownership, and the so-called commons. And then we'll delve into this 300-year-old community solution. And then hopefully some questions at the end of that. So once more, before I start, I just want to say unabashedly, this might just come across as a promo for Ethiopia. It changed my life, and not just because they chew a lot of chat, which is that leaf you can see there. These were some guys whose truck had broken down, and I think they'd probably been there for about a week, but they were still happy, which says a lot about chat. So this is topographical map of Ethiopia, very clear. You can see the Red Sea, Kenya to the south, Somalia to the east, and Sudan to the west. And if you could, just imagine all of the high altitude areas you can see there, the lighter colored ones, as being part of one. So you've got the Arabian Peninsula, obviously across the Red Sea. You can see how that would have fitted into the V of the fractured rift in Ethiopia. So just think about that as the Ethiopian dome. So about 25 million years ago, this fractured, and obviously tectonic plates and a bit of drift and what have you, and you get the formation of the Red Sea, and obviously the Gulf going out into the Indian Ocean. And this rift valley, so-called, that then goes from here all the way down to the Okavango in southern Africa. So they're called different things, but just for the sake of tonight, there you can see the Arabian Peninsula, the western or northern highlands on the northern side of the rift, and the eastern on the southern side of the rift, and then the Afar Depression, the Danakil, and so on. So those, the sort of tops, the most high altitude places there, the ones in white, those are what you would call glacial refugia. So when we went through the last ice age, just the last one, for example, probably 20, I don't know, in the last 25 million years. So about 12,000 years ago, the last ice age started to dissipate. But what you have in those black polygons there, those are those same high Afro-alpine peaks. And what happens what happened during the glacial period is that you get a drying of the continent and a shrinking of moist habitat to what are called refugia. So the Congo, where Magda is from, there were portions of the Congo that formed those kinds of refugia. Where Gaal is talking about Rwanda in a couple of weeks, the portions along the Albertine Rift that were refugia. And then in Ethiopia, you get these. I've just numbered 3 there. So in the north, and this is just really for orientation purposes, in the north, you can see that's the Simeon Mountains. It's a national park. And in the south, you can see number 2 there. That's the Bali Mountains National Park. And then number 3 in the middle, that's an area called Gwasa, Gwasa Mens or Mens Gwasa, that we'll be talking a bit more about tonight. So this pattern, or this geological and climate change over tens of hundreds of thousands of years resulted in sort of patterns of endemism. And Ethiopia has huge levels of endemism, probably, I think, second only to South Africa in terms of birds on the continent. I'm sure Gail will correct me in a couple of weeks. And thanks to Alistair Kilpin, who's listening in, I see, for lending me some of his photographs. These are some of the endemic bird species in Ethiopia. Blue-winged goose in the top left, got a white-collared pigeon top right, wattled ibis bottom right, Roche's rail at the bottom left. These are endemic to Ethiopia and Eritrea. I'm going to get into the details. Abyssinian longclaw, top left, top right is a Ethiopian siskin or black-headed siskin. Bottom right is an Abyssinian catbird. Just about everything in Ethiopia is either Abyssinian or Ethiopian as a prefix. And then bottom left is a bird called an Ankobasiran. That's a very range-restricted species. So you get these. There's a spot-breasted lapwing on the left and a thick-billed raven on the right. So you get very interesting patterns of distribution in these highlands. This is not an endemic. It's actually quite a widespread bird, red-billed chough. And the next page will show you what I mean. And the point of including this and the next bird in the slides is to show how Ethiopia, in those glacial periods, or not during the glacial periods, but in between, when there's a more defined conduit between cold, high-altitude areas, you can see how this bird, which goes across the Palearctic, also occurs only just into Africa and Morocco, in the Atlas Mountains, and then also in the Ethiopian Highlands. The same applies to the bearded vulture, the lamachai, and here you can see a similar sort of distribution pattern. This lamachai obviously can travel much further distances more easily than the chough, and so you can see that coming all the way down to Lesotho in South Africa there. Then getting to the mammals, the endemic larger mammals, I think there's probably maybe 30 endemic mammals to Ethiopia and Eritrea. A lot of them are rodents. But the larger ones are like this, the Ethiopian wolf. You can see the distribution top left, also very kind of isolated to those refugia. And then you get the gelada, a kind of grass-eating monkey rather than a baboon. And that's got a broader kind of distribution, but you can see they're much more strongly focused on the northern part of the rift and a very small distribution on the south. Something like the mountain inyala, which only occurs on the southern side of the rift, and the Bali monkey similarly. This tells you a lot about how these species colonized or survived in these refugia. This one, even more so, the Walia ibex, only occurs in the simians. Menelix bushbuck, which is a subspecies, you can see here much darker and less white markings than you would find everywhere else in Africa. And then a subspecies again, the Swan's hartebeest, which occurs just in the Rift Valley in 3 places, one of which is an introduced population. And then some very bizarre rodents. And these really are a hallmark of these Afro-alpine systems. So this is a giant mole rat or a giant root rat, which occurs only in the Bali Massif, where it makes up a large proportion of wolf prey. I'd put this shot in. It's one of Russell's, who Chris mentioned earlier, just to show the size of the creature. It's almost a kilogram, and I think per square K, you can almost 3 tons in terms of biomass. So they occur at very high densities, and this is what supports the wolves in this habitat. So we saw how endemism was related to altitude and how that related to refugia and climate change and what have you. And the same applies to productivity. So here, teff, this is an Eragrostis grass species that is endemic to Ethiopia, and which gets ground into a flour to make injera, which is kind of the staple food. So here you can see where it grows, and you can see how that matches the distributions we've just been looking at. The same applies to grazing, and so cattle, this is cattle, the same applies to sheep and goats, similar kind of distributions. And of course, the same then applies to human population density. And the point about all of this is to talk about how, I mean, Ethiopia has a population over 80 million. I think it's a country the size of South Africa, and obviously very high population densities in the fertile areas and low population densities in the more arid areas. And of course, everyone knows it from the 80s for famine. And I guess that's the reputation that it has in a lot of places. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that as a result of this concentration of humans and wildlife in narrow zones, you get a huge sort of overlap and competition for resources. This is in the Rift Valley at a lake called Awassa. This is also in the Rift Valley, another of Alistair's photos where you can see just cheek by jowl. I mean, this is all parts of Africa coming together. This is the biggest population of swans hartebeest is in this tiny little enclave of grassland that's surrounded by people, and it's not fenced. I mean, you can see something that looks like a fence in the background there, but it's just an isolated area. So what you have here is these swans hartebeest living in the sea of humanity and using the grass, but the people who live around that area using that grass as well in a quite structured fashion. So here the people were waiting to enter the reserve to gather the grass. As you go up the sides of the Rift Valley, you can see how degraded the forest becomes. And that's, again, obviously as a result of competition for resources. And then into the highlands where, again, cheek by jowl. So a wetland with white-winged flufftail, which is obviously a critically endangered bird, would be right in amongst the state-owned dairy. And so cranes migrating from Europe would be 200 in a field like this, a bit like the Western Cape in South Africa. And then you get a very intensive utilization of the land where you've got this terracing for wheat or teff, barley, those kinds of things. Here you can also see, maybe not in real time, but the evidence of this overlap of utilization of a resource. Here you've got all of those brown dots are geladas, and then there's a horse sort of in the bottom right quadrant next to a pump, a water pump. And you can see these pathways across the valley slopes, and you can see a whole heap of erosion that results from that. That's basically from overgrazing from domestic stock. And you can see how that would compromise the food resource of geladas. The same happens in wolf habitat, and that is wolf habitat. The same happens here, where you get very intense grazing of alpine plateaus, and that then changes the rodent assemblages, which influences wolf ecology. And more than that, you obviously get people and dogs and all of these sorts of things which start to have an impact on these endemic species. So here you can see a study in the Bali Mountains which looked at the overlap of livestock, so domestic livestock, the blue stripes, mountain inyala, the endemic large ungulate in green stripes, and then where both occurred in red. So there's a bit of overlap, but what's more to the point here is how one excludes the other, and it isn't the inyala excluding the livestock; it's the other way around. So that, obviously pushes indigenous species to the edge of its kind of survival. With the wolves, there's a more insidious kind of impact with obviously canine diseases like rabies and distemper. And you can see here where wolf density is dramatically affected through sporadic outbreaks of these diseases. So this is density in the Webb Valley, which is sort of the highest wolf population density area. And that's, I mean, these are the sorts of things that drive species to extinction. So with all of that pressure, overlap, and fighting for resources, a competition for resources, you still have wolves surviving. So you've got them in the two biggest populations in the Bali Mountains in the south. You can see that it's labeled as 170 wolves. That's post a disease outbreak. It will recover to maybe around 220 or 250 wolves. And then the simians right in the north, which can fluctuate between, say, 50 and 90 wolves. The others are actually not formally protected areas. And that implies they're utilized by people, yet still a third of the population exists in those areas. And that's what I want to look at tonight. So how's that able to happen? And the one particular area I want to look at is this, as I said earlier, it's the manse area, and they have an area within that they've set aside for guasa grass that they call guasa, or guasa manse, or manse guasa. So this is what it looks like. The surrounding area is quite intensively cultivated and settled, grazed, and so on. And in essence, people have been living the same way here for hundreds of years. So the same crops, the same cultivation systems, the same livestock, the same means of threshing wheat. I mean, that's, you know, this is not this, it's more medieval than the sort of thing you'd see in a industrialized agricultural economy, where they'll tether some sort of heifer or to any cow or donkey to a center post and then thresh the wheat. And as you can see here, really eking out an existence in the kind of land that you wouldn't typically settle unless you were desperate. So here's a map of Guasa in green. And to the west of it, to the left there, you've got the 8 peasant associations that fall under these kebeles, sort of a parish. And these 8 peasant associations have responsibility for the guasa, and they manage it as a shared communal resource. And it's quite a not complicated, but quite an intricate and involved system. So this is guasa. There are 4 species. It's a festuca grass species, so there are 4 species that occur here. It's this tussocky grass that you can see. It doesn't look particularly palatable. But it is eaten by livestock, and it is used by people for a lot of things. And as you can see here, it's eaten by geladas who look uncannily like it. So how does the community manage the resource? So in the 1600s, 17th century, there was a Muslim invasion from the lowlands into the highlands. And once they were defeated, I think the population pattern structure changed and got reset. And there were 2 patriarchs who'd led part of this resistance, Gera and Aspa, and they kind of formed a coalition in a particular area. And they decided to, obviously the population density was lower at this point, so they set aside probably 20,000 hectares of grassland, all above a certain altitude, so above, let's say, 3,200 meters. This is where that guasa grass occurs. And so what these guys said was, no one can settle here, no one can cultivate here. You can graze it, and you can gather firewood and thatching grass and other medicinal plants. You're not allowed to sell those. This is for our own sort of subsistence use. But you can't access it all of the year or just at any particular time. We as a community are going to set this aside as a common resource, and we're going to use it in a sensible and sustainable fashion. So this is called the 1650s. I mean, I don't know what other events you can think about in the 1650s, but I can't, I'm not aware of any celebrated anyway European approaches to conservation at that point. I'm sure there were some. I'm not saying there weren't, but it's not the sort of thing that you would be considering is going on in rural, feudal, medieval Ethiopia. So in order to manage this system, there are 2 headmen basically from each of the 2 areas, so Gera and Aspa, these abakeras. and they represent each of the two areas, and they're elected unanimously in public kind of settings, like a khotla in the Botswana sense. And then in turn, they each work with an aleka from each of the parishes. So there are 8 and 6 under the two areas of 14 sort of sub-headmen. I don't know, Induna, if for the Africans on the call. And so these guys would basically get together and they would discuss the state of the Gwasa. How healthy was the system, and what was the degree of need of the community? How desperate were things? Was it a drought, or were there ample resources? How scarce was grazing? Did people need to rethatch houses and so on? So once they made that decision, they'd make, and this is usually at the peak of the dry season when people were at their most desperate, they'd make this announcement at a public event. And then anyone who could trace their heritage to being a direct descendant of either Gera or Aspo, either one of their parents, could then access the area and cut as much Gwasa as they could carry or as they wanted. And this kind of access continued until the start of the next wet season. It's also significant because of religion. This is obviously a very religious Christian area. So I think 12th of July is the date, and it's the end of one of the fasts. And this is when the area was closed again, rain started, and it was left to recover. So now the area was closed, at least for another year, but usually from between 3 to 5 years to allow the system to recover. And during that period, access was controlled through regular patrols to the extent that literally every able-bodied male headed a household would need to patrol a portion of that area. And illegal use was punished through fines of bizarre things that were very difficult to acquire. So a one-testicled servant, for example. I don't know how common that was in the 1700s. But then if you look at that last point there, a mortar made out of a shrub which never grows a trunk. This is like biblical stuff. How do you go and find something like that? Cabbage seeds when cabbages don't grow in the highlands there. So you have to, in essence, this is a deterrent. And if that wasn't deterrent enough, you'd get beaten. If you were found to have broken the law, if your livestock were found grazing there, they'd be slaughtered and skinned, the meat distributed to everyone else, and the skins used for drums in the church. If you'd thatched your house with illegally cut Gwasa, your house would be burnt down. So there are very strong deterrents about keeping this resource sacrosanct and as an emergency resource for hard times. So that lasted from 1650 to the mid-1970s when Selassie is overthrown in a socialist revolution, and you get this socialist agrarian reform and villagization and so on. And at this point, land ownership, there's not private or community land ownership is abolished. So everything belongs to the state, which is still the case today, except in urban areas. And so this, and in many places in Ethiopia it could have resulted in, the tragedy of the commons. There's a huge amount of literature on this, on the Ethiopian situation itself. But what happened, because you had this centuries-old system of the Kera, they basically adapted the peasant associations that were formed under the Derg, and they replaced Kera with a new Gwasa committee made up of these peasant associations. So, and this continued. It wasn't as successful, obviously, as pre the 1970s because the deterrents were not as aggressive, and the area wasn't closed as frequently or for as long as it was before, and so it did reduce in size a little bit. But by the drought in the early 2000s, it became clear, obviously, that it needed to be more aggressive in how they managed this. So the peasant committees peasant associations went back to a more sort of aggressive Kero-style management of the area. And then more recently, ecotourism has been pursued. And the reason why that's been possible is because there are these associated biodiversity and ecosystem service benefits to just conserving a mutually beneficial resource such as the guasa grass. So very simply, and I've just taken three major elements here. Guasa, I mean, in the early 2000s had the third largest wolf population outside in Ethiopia and the largest outside of the formerly protected area. So that's changed a little bit, but it's still, let's say, top 5 most important wolf populations. So 20 to 25 animals there. And then it's also got one of Ethiopia's most important Gelada populations of 2,000 animals. The wolves obviously are critically endangered. The geladas are not. But as you saw from the way the highlands are settled, obviously habitat fragmentation is happening apace, and it's only a matter of time. Besides those two quite iconic flagship species, obviously there's a whole heap of other endemism. That Ancoba serin, for example, occurs here, and a whole lot of other birds and rodents. But also this area protects the eyes or the watershed for no less than 26 streams and rivers, most of which flow towards the Blue Nile, become part of the Blue Nile, and then onward into Egypt. But also some down into the Awash, which goes through the Afar Depression towards Djibouti. So this is obviously a water tower in modern part that wasn't conserved for that reason. It's just a byproduct. And it's also one of the world's most important areas for the protection of a critically endangered, in fact, the world's most endangered canid. So, and these are byproducts of a community setting aside a piece of land in order to have resources that saw them through hard times. So what you have here, and we're done with the slides with writing, I promise, is this Gelada population. Incredibly charismatic animals. It's the only member of its genus. It's a grass-eating monkey. I think it's the only exclusively grass-eating monkey in Africa, if not the world. I'm not sure. And used to be widespread. This is the last example of the genus. And they forage and live in these big herds or clans. So they get these. You can see the males mixed in amongst the more shaggy cape mane mantled creatures. And so you get these single male units that aggregate into herds. This particular group is usually around 200 to 220 animals, but they do gather into 400, 500, 700, even over 1,000 animals. And there's lots of theories about that. It's probably an anti-predator behavior. And as you can see here, there's a Gelada male in the guasa there, and right below him you can see the terraced farming that looks like fallow fields, but there was probably wheat or teff at one point. And they do crop rate. So this is one of the costs I was talking about earlier with regard to communities setting aside natural ecosystems in areas adjacent to where they live. They also have wolves, and this is an incredible species that it should be on everyone's bucket list, the same as a mountain gorilla or something. So I want to go back to the question that I asked you to think about at the beginning. What drives conservation? What are the circumstances or the factors that result in a community saying, let's set aside a piece of land that we live adjacent to, we utilize sporadically, and we tolerate the costs that come with it, whether it's livestock raiding by predators or crop raiding by herbivores. What are the things that result in that? I mean, is that, obviously colonial conservation had a lot of its basis in setting aside hunting reserves so that there would be something to hunt. And I think, the idea that conservation can happen for the sake of conservation is something that just doesn't fly in many rural communities or societies. It's a first world luxury. So if you've got a hierarchy of needs and they're all taken care of, and you can start to think philosophically about, an organism's right to exist the same as you do, or however you approach it. Those are all well and good. But how do you make a conservation, let's say in an African context, in a rural African context, how do you make conservation viable, acceptable, tolerable, and beneficial to the people who have to live with its costs? I mean, I think the lesson from this institution, this Kera, is that you can use indigenous conservation systems and you can adapt them to the modern world. That's the first one. The second is that they have to generate livelihood benefits. So whether that is natural products, non-timber forest products as they're called, or whether it is the revenue from ecotourism, employment, or whether you're selling produce to tourists, what are those things that we need to put in place in order to encourage the conservation of important ecosystems, not just for biodiversity, but also for ecosystem services? So, and then the last question from me to you is, what can you do? In fact, it's not a question, actually. It's a suggestion. The Menskwasa area is now organized under those peasant associations and the evolution of that into a ecotourism product. So you can go and stay there. It's only, let's say, 3 or maybe 4 hours drive from Addis. It's the closest, in fact, place to Addis that you could see wolves, although it's higher densities in the Bali Mountains. But it really is an exceptional place to see geladas, and also to interact with the local community and get a sense of just how traditional societies live with wildlife. So the suggestion is to go and live there, to go and interact with these people, to talk to them about how they engage or interrelate with nature. And then also to enjoy, obviously, the byproduct of this conservation system. So go and find the geladas as they come up to sun themselves after roosting on the cliffs at night. Sit with them as they wake up and listen to what is a really wide vocal repertoire, and watch them as they shuffle around on their bums and pick. Sorry, I'm being very. Mark is probably laughing at me from a primatological point of view. Very mimicry here. But watch them as they pluck the shoots from whichever grass species they're eating, and then follow them as they forage. So they are habituated, they are tolerated by people, even though they do crop raid. And you get to sit close to them while they do a whole heap of bizarre things. This is the lip flare of the male. You can see those pale eyes, and the exposure, obviously, of the canines. This is usually a signal to another male. Or the youngsters playing, or look at how the females and males communicate with each other through physical symbols. Or you might be lucky enough to come across someone like this who I hope's life was also changed by Ethiopia. And that's it from me.